So hi everyone, I'm Ruth Graham. I'm the Society's Chief Executive Officer, and it's really my privilege this evening to be chairing a panel session that's really going to be addressing what's so important about First Fleeters Susannah Holmes and Henry Kable. And so this is all to do with this work. I'll be introducing our panel shortly, but we're coming together to talk about the true story of the Lost Parcel, which has been put together by the Rule of Law Education Centre. I'd firstly like us to pause though and to think about the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. And I'd like us to recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, culture, and the support of storytelling. And it's, particularly important because obviously this session is focused around First Fleeters and thinking about the impact that the First Fleet had on First Nations people. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present of the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and that's the place. That's the beloved country where the Society's offices and archives are located. And I'd also like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. For those who are with us live, many of you are very much familiar with using Zoom. We're on the Zoom meetings platform tonight. So just a bit of housekeeping that you have the freedom to change the view so that you can see either those that are spotlighted for presenting or the whole gallery of faces of those in the audience. And that's generally at the top right-hand corner of your screen or at the bottom of the screen, depending on the kind of device that you're using. We'd ask that for those that aren't speaking, that you keep yourselves on mute so that those presenting aren't disturbed, and that you're conscious of understanding what's going on in your household, that when you are, we will have a sort of Q&A session as part of tonight's event, and that you have the opportunity to speak, but just be conscious that there might be others in your household making a noise. If you're having issues with your internet, you might want to turn off your video so that you can stop your video or have your face showing when you're speaking as well, and that just helps out. We very much encourage conversation, and that's both using the chat function so that you can text a comment or a question as we're going along, but also at the end of the session so that we can kind of gather some of those thoughts together. Okay, a little bit of information about other things that are happening in society. It's great to have this Lost Parcel event as part of our National Family History Month activities. There's a lot happening, and this week is a bit of a book week. Tomorrow night I'll be hosting our book club, which is going to take us to Fiji, which I'm really looking forward to. And for those who are in Sydney tomorrow, our library is having an open morning, which you can go along and meet the team and find out about how to use those facilities. There's a whole lot of other activities listed, and so we're really excited to welcome you to either our online or in-person events. So tonight's story is about convicts, but I'd also like to remind you that we've just been launching our own particular convict project, the Ironclad Sisterhood. Its second episode of the podcast was released last week, and it's a real insight into thinking about the treatment of convicts, particularly convict women. And this project is all to do with research that Society volunteer Jess Hill put together, and now we've translated it into 21st century medium of websites and also a podcast. So I'd really encourage you, if you are interested in convicts, and if you hadn't found this site as yet, have a look at it. The site contains the database of the research, but also that there are links to the podcast as well. You don't have to go somewhere else for the podcast. Okay, right, but on to tonight and the Lost Parcel. So I'm going to introduce the panel tonight. I'm supported as always with our education manager, Vanessa Casson, who's going to be keeping an eye on everybody and monitoring the chat. But we also have special guests, Sally Layson, who's the CEO of the Rule of Law Education Centre and one of the authors of the new book, The Lost Parcel. And, you know, it is really a captivating storybook about the couple, the convict couple, Henry and Susannah Kable, and the disappearance of their parcel of belongings on the First Fleet, and really how that turned into the first civil case in New South Wales, or the new colony. Bill Kable is one of the descendants of Henry and Susannah, and a fifth generation descendant. And, you know, from the marriage held on the 10th of February, 1788 between Henry and Susannah. Bill is a solicitor and, you know, fascinated by the story of that first lawsuit. And when really Henry and Susannah stood up to the captain of the Alexander from the First Fleet. But we'll hear more about what happened on that soon. Paul is with us as well. Paul Kable is another descendant, and his professional background is from the Australian Navy. He served 37 years at sea in operational positions in war and in peace, you know, doing the country proud, including 2 major warship commands and ashore in training, planning, diplomatic and command positions. This is a whole other maybe webinar we need to do, Vanessa, as well, about the Australian Navy and history. And he has a website, Damned Rascal, which we'll put a link to in the chat as well, which is a chronicle of Henry and Susannah Kable. Okay, and you know, this book has been produced by the Rule of Law Education Centre, and I'll introduce Sally, but it's something I knew a little bit about before we were engaged in discussions about this event, but I'm really impressed with the work that they do. That, you know, it's their raison d'etre, like the Society of Australian Genealogists, to actually provide education. And so what we have tonight is really a perfect marriage of history, family history, and the law. And what they do is, you know, support us to, you know, recognise the importance of, you know, work such as the Magna Carta and the rule of law principles, and how they relate to contemporary issues. So Sally, really, maybe you can give us a brief synopsis of the book, and you know, gain us all in sort of the understanding of a bit of its background.
Wonderful. I'd love to. So what I might do is share my screen, so you don't have to look at me, but you can look at some of our beautiful drawings in the book. So I'll just share my screen. Let's see. Excellent. So this is the cover of our book, The Lost Parcel, which is the true story of Henry and Susannah Kable, as you've just heard, who are convicts on the First Fleet. This is what is known as the great Australian love story. It really should be a Hollywood blockbuster. It's got love, it's got lust, it's got hardship, determination, fair go, every great Australian thing that we love. The narrative of our Lost Parcel book, if I can get this working, actually follows a letter written by Reverend Johnson. He wrote a letter back to Evan Nepean in England in 1788, straight after the case. And it tells a really extraordinary story of Susannah and Henry, these 2 poor convict kids, they were about 20 at the time, who were both caught for stealing separately, both sentenced to death. They're reprieved, but then their sentence changed to transportation to the colonies. These 2 star-crossed lovers met in jail, and as you would expect, they had a little boy, Henry Jr. Susannah is then selected to travel as a convict in the First Fleet. Henry just Susannah and her child. Henry pleads with the authorities to let them get married and for him to go, but it fell on deaf ears, because you can imagine they already had way too many men going on the First Fleet. Susannah and the baby were taken on board the Hulk Dunkirk, but as she nears the Hulk, the captain of the ship refuses to take the baby with her on board. She is distraught. She's dragged away, as you can see in this picture. And believe it or not, the prison jailer is left holding the baby. He is absolutely filled with sympathy. he rushes into a carriage and puts the baby on his lap and travels a round trip of about 700 miles to London. He waits outside the premises of Lord Sydney and begs him to let the baby join Susannah on the first fleet. Lord Sydney says yes, and he even pushes his luck further and he says, okay, what about Henry, the dad? And Lord Sydney again says, sure, you can take them both. So when the English public hear about this case, they hear how cruel it is that a baby could be thrust from a breastfeeding mother. They are outraged, and they do a public collection, and they raise nearly 20 pounds, which is over twice the annual salary. So a significant amount of money is raised to buy goods for them in their new life. So the couple survive the long journey on the first fleet, some of it together and some of it separate, and they reach the Sydney colony. And along with 4 other couples, they're the first Anglican wedding ceremony. But their story doesn't end there. There's more drama. When they ask the ship's captain for their belongings, it can't be found. Now, we don't know if it's been stolen or it's lost, but we do know that the ship's captain, who is a very powerful man, just dismissed their claims. And for this was extremely tragic for them. So they had a parcel of goods worth about 2 years' salary to set them up for the new colony. And this had all their hopes and all their dreams pinned on this parcel. They had everything against them. They were poor, they were illiterate, and they'd lost this parcel. They were convicts in the land. So what did they do? They brought the first civil case in the colony. So this is a copy of one of the writ that they had in our books. And if you have a look at it, the words "new settlers of this place" has been crossed out. Now, the legal experts in the world will tell you that convicts are dead to the law. And so they can't actually go to court. They can't give evidence. So what they've worked out is we'll just conveniently ignore, we'll cross it out that they're convicts, and we won't replace it with a profession. So it was a little bit cheeky. And so they could run this case. The other bit I love about this writ is how they've signed their names. You can see it on the bottom, they've both put an X. So we know they're both illiterate. So here we've got 2 poor convicts. They're illiterate. They're on the other side of the world from all their family, and their parcel of dreams has been lost. They go to court and they sue one of the most powerful men in the colony, the ship's captain. And believe it or not, in this new colony, they were able to win. This was an absolutely landmark decision. Not only was it the first civil case, but it set this new precedent for this penal colony. It's this confusion of, are we convicts? But a convict, can they own property? Can they sue? Can they go to court? And it set this foundation that we call as a fair go in Australia, this idea of equality, that even a poor convict couple who has no money, no rights, no family, no connections, has a chance before the law, has equality before the law and equal protection to get their property and their goods restored back to them. So in the end, the ship's captain allegedly had to pay damages for almost the whole amount, except for a few books that were found. Wouldn't have really helped them because they couldn't read. And our story ends with this beautiful letter that we know that Henry, or someone on behalf of Henry, wrote to his mother back in England. And I love that it finishes, "Our little boy Henry is a promising little fellow and goes to school. It's day here when it's night with you." So this kind of really finishes our story of a positive ending for the Henrys at this point. I'll stop sharing now.
That's great, Sally. It's a fantastic introduction, and I think, you know, it's really interesting to think about this as a you know, such a landmark case for the beginning of the colonies, and really, you know, why is it important? You know, how does this story fit into what the Rule of Law Education Centre is all about?
Absolutely. So from our name, you can guess that we educate students in the Australian community, and we educate them about the rule of law, about the Magna Carta, like you said, And all these principles are quite unknown today. If I go to talk to a student or an adult about what is the rule of law, generally they won't know. But at the heart of the rule of law is that no one is above the law, and the law is applied equally and fairly to everyone. That's how we simply describe it. So this case is fantastic, because the idea that no one is above the law, and the flip side is no one is under the law, which means a poor convict couple and a rich, powerful captain are treated equally before the law. And there's so many elements in this case that point to equal and fair justice. We know they couldn't write, so someone wrote the writ for them. We know that they were able to give evidence, and actually one of the people who gave evidence on behalf to say that they knew about the parcel was Hunter, who was the captain of the Sirius. So it wasn't like it was the poor convicts against the rich elite. It was a system that before the law, that idea that law is blind, that everyone should have that equal protection, that protection for their goods. So that's why we as an organization love it, because it actually says what we think is the core of our democracy, which is this equality, that we all should have equal access to justice and to be able to protect our goods or our property or our land if something's happened to it.
Mm. And maybe they were sort of like a point for the start of the kind of egalitarian Australian society of, considering, how the transition from the class-based system that they came from in England, manifested itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there was an awful lot to unpack there, but back to the actual book, though. So why this book? Why this time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Where did you get the inspiration?
So, as you saw, the way we wrote the book was we started with source documents. We went back to the core, what we would say, what kids could go, well, that really happened. So inspiration was actually finding some letters. We found Reverend Johnson's letter. We found Henry Kable's letter. We found the actual writ, and we could see all these source documents. And we found some of them online, and later I came and had a chat to you guys, and we found about Paul Kable's book, and his book then really gave us depth of knowledge. And so we as a team, so I worked on the book. We have about 3 teachers who worked on the book, paralegals and lawyers. We all worked on it, and we just wanted to show students and give teachers a tool that they could teach this great idea. The other thing is, you'll see that the book is actually dedicated to Robin Speed. He's the founder of the Rule of Law Education Centre, and he founded it 10 years ago. He was a migrant, and he really believed Australians needed to understand our key foundations and key democracy and the rule of law, so we could fight when it didn't happen, because the rule of law is not a perfect thing. And we might talk about that later. It's an ideal. It was an ideal then, and it's an ideal now. Like, there are things that it doesn't always happen like we want it to. So our job as Australians is to go, hey, this didn't happen, and so our founder was really passionate, especially against bullies. And the rule of law is the ultimate protection about people who have lots of power. It means that before the law, you have equal access to the law. It means, and yet again, it's not always perfect, but it was about all people deserve justice. And we've always felt that the Kables, the society tells us that they didn't deserve justice. They're done, and I know we'll talk about, they were a bit of a damned rascal. They were a bit cheeky, but in the eyes of the law, they were to receive equal protection for what had happened for them.
Can I just make a point there that before this law case, there had been overturning by Governor Phillip and the Attorney General David Collins and Reverend Johnson, in that allowing those 5 couples to get married on the 10th of February 1788, because the reason Henry and Susannah weren't married before was that then felons lost all their civil rights. So they lost the right to be married, and that was, arrival in New South Wales, that was restored by decisions of the leaders of the settlement.
Absolutely. And that's a really important point, because as mentioned, they couldn't get married. They wanted to get married in England and they couldn't. And so a convict came to Australia and actually had more rights here than their friends who are left back in the Norwich jail, which is a really, that's quite a mind-blowing concept that we don't quite understand, that when we let them come here, they got married, which they couldn't get married. And that's a really great example of it.
And Sally, and maybe Bill can answer this as well, is their story taught in law schools in Australia and anywhere else in terms of
Bill, you go.
What happened?
Yeah, well, this story, I first heard about it in 1969 in first year law. And at that stage, I wasn't really very familiar with the Kable story, but I got a big surprise when the lecturer said the first civil law case in Australia was Kable and Sinclair. So yeah, that was my first brush with the story. And, you know, since then, I've been very interested in it. And I think it's fantastic that Sally has taken the story and run with it with such a you know, well-researched and an interesting booklet that she's produced, the Lost Parcel.
And apart from Bill and Paul, I think we've got quite a few other members of the extended Kable family with us tonight, or catching up on the recording, which is fantastic. And I think it's something, as family historians, it's amazing for us to uncover people with these great stories and pivotal moments in our nation's history. And I was curious that you know, it took people to go to law school to find out maybe about this, Sally, because I was wondering, you know, what was really the motivation as to write this as a children's book, and does the centre write mostly for children or sort of school age readers?
Absolutely. So Bill, to answer to whether current law students do it, we hire paralegals who are all at law school, and I haven't heard them say they've done it. So I'm not sure how things have changed.
Well, my daughter is actually, she did law at ANU, and it was raised at ANU, I know.
So that's fantastic.
Yeah, there is some coverage, and they've got some of the documents in the old Parliament House on display. So she was intrigued to see those documents. So
yeah, absolutely. So the reason why we write this, so you can see behind me, we have a few of our resources, and if you look on the website, we predominantly write resources for Year 11 and Year 12 students. We write a lot of case studies to help them understand the law. But what we're finding is they don't know the principles before they get to the tricky bits. And to understand presumption of innocence, to understand a fair and prompt trial, you really need to understand the first principles. And one of those happens to be equality before the law. You know, equality is a key thing to understand before you start moving on. So we started writing resources for upper primary and younger students. And so this book is really aimed at Year 5 to 6 and Year 9 students, because it's in the curriculum, more so in the Australian than the New South Wales curriculum. And we know that teachers will be able to use it because it's written by teachers, it's linked to the curriculum, and we have resources, free resources on our website with handouts. So for example, civics and citizenship, if you do that in all states but New South Wales, you look at what the equal protection of the law is, and you look at what is equality before the law as a key principle of our nation. If you do commerce in New South Wales, you'll touch on it. Also, if you do history in Year 5, 6, up to Year 9, you'll often look at the experiences of people in the first colony, and you'll have to research experiences of them in the first colony, and you'll need to look at source documents. So we know that this provides enough information for them that they can do source documents. If you look on our website, we point them to Bill's book, so you can, to Paul's book, so you can buy Paul's book and it's got lots of them, or we point you to the original articles or the original writ. So it helps them, a student, see it for themselves, these things. So, and that's what we really wanted them to know it. But also it's this cross curriculum. You can do history, and as you said, you can actually learn a bit of democracy at the same time, because we're really lucky in Australia. Unfortunately, we don't know it so well, but we've had a lot of individuals who've had key elements and have helped our nation be the fair nation that we mostly are. So that's not saying we're perfect, and I'll keep saying the rule of law is not we're not perfect, and I can see it today, but it's something that we actually it really does aim to provide a protection. And it's seen back to the days of Magna Carta, it was a protection against big rule, essentially.
It's Alan Byrne here. Just curious, I've read some of this story before in different places, just in passing. But I'd be interested to know, what was the duration between the time the Kables arrived in Australia and when the writ was served? And following that, there was such a change in the mindset toward law and order. Who initiated that? Who was the driver in the government or in the fleet that drove more rights for convicts?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
Yep.
the instructions that Governor Phillip had from the King made it clear that he was all powerful once they arrived in New South Wales, and the King had given him the freedom to make those sorts of decisions. So my hero, Arthur Phillip, I think was instrumental in allowing these things to happen.
And going back to Lord Sydney, so there's a fantastic article, if you want to Google it, by Windia, and he talked about the rule of law, and he ran through how there was the first commissioning written for Arthur Phillip, and then it was a more military style. Then they went, okay, actually, we've got a problem. We've got all these convicts, so we're going to need to have courts. So they wrote the first Charter of Justice. And what they did is when they settled the convict, and they said to be Lord Sydney's dream, is they allowed courts, not military courts, although they were predominantly early days filled with military men. By having courts, that was actually their vision. Whether they had articulated how it would work, but by the nature of doing the first Charter of Justice and saying we're going to have courts, that actually opened the way. And so therefore if you read about the Australian history, the courts were actually the key area where you could hold the governor to account. It was actually like, there's Wyatt writes in his book about the Rum Rebellion, that was like the key place where, or you could hold them to account. And the problem was a lot of the courts didn't have lawyers. So Collins wasn't even a lawyer, but he could write this amazing writ. He understood evidence. He had Blackstone's commentaries with him. But the early days, we didn't have any lawyers here, or worse still, if we had a lawyer here, he was a convict, which you can imagine caused so many problems. But that's for another day to talk about that.
It was a real paradigm shift, wasn't it? It was just out of the box to allow this writ to go ahead, when back home it wouldn't have been, if I understand it correctly, wouldn't have even been considered.
Absolutely.
And that relates to, I think, Lisa's question in the chat, and we'll get to the other questions as well later. But I think the maybe the confidence of putting things forward. But given what you've just said, Sally, it's probably the case that the convicts had really extensive experience of the legal system, more so than those that were ruling them.
In some ways they did, and that came out later with Wentworth. But what a lot of people say is what those people came with was a knowledge of what they called their British birthrights. They knew, unlike us, they knew their Magna Carta. They knew their habeas corpus. They knew what they had. And I know that they were dead to the law, but supposedly in a lot of letters that went back to England, they always mentioned the Magna Carta. They always mentioned that those rights, and later it became trial by jury that was one of their rights. But it's thought that they understood themselves and they had a real passion for that. And Bill, you might know a bit better than I do, being a lawyer.
Yes. Well, the phrase is often used as "dead to the law," and while they were in England, yes, they couldn't things we take for granted. They couldn't get married. They had no property rights. They couldn't initiate any legal action. They couldn't vote. I'm sure there are a lot of things that they were denied. But like I think you'd have to say Henry did far better in Australia than he could ever have hoped to have done back in England. Apart from not being, he was nearly hanged. But even if he had survived that, his life would have been very different from what he became a prosperous businessman in the colony. So
yes, it's just such an interesting story of all of those sort of early colonialists, whether they were convicts or free settlers, and the difference between their progress and others that maybe stayed home. So Sally, I wanted to ask you, just again in the development of the book and thinking about the law and rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and really, about their story and its incorporation in the text and research around the work. Can you talk us through that?
The Indigenous perspective was probably the hardest section to write in our book. And it's juggling the tension. And one of the leading Indigenous lawyers explains we've got this layered Australian identity. He says we've got three strands of an epic story: the ancient Indigenous heritage, the British heritage, and a multicultural triumph. And it's that idea that we're holding these ideas that we want to talk about, but to be respectful and understand it. We took the approach that this is a book about the British heritage and the underlying principles that remain today, that have actually made the Australia today, it's given us our protections. Knowing that, and that is being our key message, we didn't want to not acknowledge that what happened to the Indigenous, they were significantly impacted by the rule of law. The protections that Susannah and Henry received were not actually afforded to the Indigenous. We know that they suffered greatly, that their legal rights, their goods, their land, they didn't receive the same protection from the law. And we can talk about that more in that they couldn't take action, give evidence. And it's a really hard thing to juggle as a teacher to work through. So our approach was to look at it from a rule of law, that the ideal is still that everyone receives the equal protection from the law, and to acknowledge that it wasn't done like we would have liked it. We really, it has been a sad chapter, that what happened. But also the flip side is we wish that there had been equal protection, and we kind of moved to look to the future, which is we want all Australians to have the equal protection, and we want all anyone who comes to our land, no matter their background, no matter their gender, no matter their wealth, their family connections. The hope is that ideal, that the law, they get equal protection. Now, there's also some really good articles written about the rule of law in Indigenous, and one of our friends at the Rule of Law is Professor Martin Krieger at UNSW, and he has a lot of fantastic articles to read about why the rule of law didn't work, how it requires even policing out in the frontiers, and so much we could have put in, but we decided that the main point was really, let's look at what are our foundations from the British heritage and how have they worked today, and how can they go in the future, which is what our hope is, that they're things that protect us all going forward.
No, that's a really great point. And I think the different points in history, there are those that are benefiting and those that aren't. And we're hoping at this point, everybody's kind of caught up. Yep. With kind of having those rights but before the law in all the different spheres. But it is interesting kind of getting this story from the 1700s. So why is it good to showcase this now and put this in a text and provide it to school students? Why is it why do you think it's a device that will help most of children to learn?
Yeah, so I think it's a good way to put an abstract principle into a thing that a child can understand. So because the rule of law, equal protection is theoretical, what we like most is it's a story. So even if it happened a year ago, the story still remains. So this happens to be a bit more romantic, but they've got bigger love story than I think I could find. But and it's a relatively clean case. So, you know, a lot of the cases we write for year 11 and year 12 students, I most definitely could not be giving to a year 5 or 6 student. So it's a really good everyday case that explains this abstract concept of equality in a way for children. And the other bit is, I think in Australia, unlike in America, because we haven't had a revolution or a war to have our freedoms, it's good to know where our freedoms come from. Some of our freedoms have just appeared, but actually sometimes they've had to have moments in history that have pushed them along. And it's good to know what moments in our history, in the Australian history, in the many different paths, have led us to what we have today, that we can't necessarily feel or appreciate what protects us, but it's there anyway. So it's part of them showing what they can't necessarily see because they've grown up with it a lot of their lives. So that's why we think a story like the Kables, and gee, it's just a great part of our, this one story. It's just, like I said, a great Australian love story. It's a blockbuster in that it's just great to read. There's great newspaper articles and supporting documents.
And just referring to the audience, anyone that wants to fund the film, please, maybe speak to Sally, Bill and Paul. We might have to do some crowdfunding to get the movie done.
We have tried to get what you'd call a docudrama on their story, but so far no success.
There is a rock opera that was recorded by Peter Bellamy some years ago. So in the days when rock operas were the big thing. So, but we haven't made it to the big screen yet.
Yeah, I think we need to send a copy of this to Margot Robbie. She seems to be on a winner at the moment, so you never know. She's an Aussie girl. She might be interested in the story. It's great to have the descendants here with us, and I might turn to you first, Bill. Did you know you had these ancestors from the get-go? Were they always part of, the stories around the dinner table?
Well,
did you know you had convicts?
I think we're probably still a little bit close to the convict stain, as it used to be called. But of course, my father said that his father would never admit that Henry was a convict. So it's come through. And as I say, I didn't know much about it until probably about 1968. When we started having these gatherings. I think it was because someone wanted to update the grave of Henry Kable, which is Henry and Susannah is in Windsor. And it's sort of grown from that. We had a massive dinner in 1988 on the anniversary of the first wedding. So there were, I think 120, a great number of people descended on the Regent. And it's grown from that. I mean, we had another reunion only a few years ago. So the Kable story has grown within the family, I think, over that period.
The first time we knew for sure what their background was in 1965. As a teenage naval officer, I'd been sent to the UK for training, and I went to the Public Records Office in London, which was then in Chancery Lane. And I had been loaded up with the family myths that Henry was a Marine officer or he was a political prisoner. And then I found the charge sheets, which made it clear that he was a burglar and she was a thief. And it was interesting research. Because the original documents are there to be found. So I got clues from microfiche, because the documents had been filmed on reels of camera film, and spent days winding through the microfiche, found the 2 charge sheets, and also the reprieves. That was a great moment when I was in the Public Records Office. I had the original document signed by Lord North and Lord Sydney, saying the King had commuted their sentences from hanging to transportation, and thought I had it in my hands and said, well, if it wasn't for these 2 documents, I wouldn't be me.
And I'd be interested, Paul, how did you tell the rest of the family?
Well, it was I was feeding back information. Then, of course, it was all by handwritten letters to several key members of the family who were willing to accept that we were descended from criminals, and gradually it got disseminated. And Bill's father was one of the people that was getting this information from me, from England.
And how did that generation react at the time in the mid-60s?
Well, differently. My grandmother never wanted to or even mention that she had married into a convict family. But so there was a mixed reaction. But now having a convict background makes you royalty in Australia. So complete change.
Exactly. It's really fascinating for me to think about this, and just how in a sense how proud we probably all are of this couple and your family, and the difference they've made, as you know, and Sally has put that into a permanent record that is going to be very much disseminated far and wide. And Bill, as you were saying before, there was the training through law schools that did mention their importance, which is important. But I guess from Bill, from your legal training and professional work, did you see this as an important concept yourself? That was it important that those that had previously been thought of as dead to the law were then afforded more rights?
Well, yes, in Australia, and it's been studied by a number of jurists. I mean, I think of Judge Staples in particular, who was very interested in this difference between Australian law and English law, that convicts could still have rights to sue. So it has wide-ranging repercussions in Australia as to, I think it was mentioned in the Bathurst jail rights, and it was also the Darcy Dugan case, which some people might remember. And the Kable case has been raised a number of times because of this initial finding that convicts did have some rights.
Okay, and looking back in, I guess, Henry's own history, he wasn't a particular stranger to courts himself.
No, well,
after
this success, he was a frequent visitor to the courts. He sued lots of people, and he went into a partnership with James Underwood and Simeon Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, he finished up suing both of them and many other people. He was a frequent litigator. I don't know whether he was encouraged by this first success, but he seems to have won most of his cases after that too.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And it's interesting. I'm going to link back to we're going to send Margot Robbie a copy of the book, because she could play Susannah, of course, in the film. And she's an attractive woman, and there was I think a rumor from the records that Susannah was very attractive, and that's why she got attention. I mean, does that hold true in any form? Where did that come from?
Well, I think we know what Henry looked like, because after 3.5 years in prison in Norwich Castle, he was still described as a fine, healthy young man. We don't have really a description about Susannah, but they got away with so much as a couple in Australia. They were looked after by the media, the church, the government, the law, and I think probably their appearance had some role in that.
In terms of being, I guess, a dynamic couple.
Yes.
I thought it was just because you're also good-looking Kables. I thought that's why all you said.
It's come down through the generations.
Look at the book cover.
And Paul, Sally mentioned before the book that you've written, and also your website, and I'll just put a link to that in the chat as well. Really, why was Henry a damn Drasco in your words?
Well, Our book has got a question mark after that, damn rascals question mark. So we leave it to the reader to decide whether they were damn rascals or not. But the original phrase came from Lieutenant Ralph Clark, who was a Marine officer on board Friendship, and he was the best journalist in on board Friendship. And he wrote on the 23rd of December, 1787, William Evans and Joseph Patrick, two of the prisoners, made a complaint that the rest of the prisoners constantly detained their allowance from them and gave them what they pleased of it. They also informed that these prisoners had stolen a great deal of wood, billets, and beef. And Clark writes, I went down to the fore prison and found the beef and 29 large billets of wood. On examining, we found that Henry Lovell and Henry Kable, two of the prisoners who had the liberty of going about the ship, had stole the beef and wood out of the forepeak when they had gone down to pump water. There never were such damn rascals collected together as there are in this ship. I will keep a sharp look after them when at botany, otherwise they will take the teeth out of my head.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thanks so much for that, Paul. And Paul, so we talked about you being, having a really, incredible career in the Navy, and perhaps you could draw on that experience to tell us a bit about, thinking about those journeys that were made by the First Fleet and subsequent ships to and from the colonies, and maybe from your expertise thinking about Sydney Cove in particular, and why that was a better location from Botany Bay for that initial fleet to arrive.
Well, the first part of your question, I nearly did find out for real what it was like, because I was part of a team that put together the First Fleet reenactment in 1988 under the leadership of the historian Jonathan King, who was a descendant of Philip Gidley King, a naval officer in the First Fleet. And when we were putting this plan together, we were stymied by the government. They didn't want anything like that to happen, which might detract from all the other things they'd planned as part of the bicentennial celebration. And the First Fleet Reenactment Committee wanted me to be the Commodore of the fleet, to play the part of Philip. And I remember a discussion I had with Sir Anthony Sinnott, then the Chief of Defence Force. He'd been told by the Prime Minister, no, Cable's not to be involved in the First Fleet reenactment. But your question is about this, the seamanship. Well, it was a beautifully executed fleet. They only lost one person overboard in the whole time. The health of the convicts was pretty good, and they took their time getting here, but they did it safely and with good management, as opposed to the subsequent fleets, which the British government contracted out to contractors whose main aim was making profits. So when the second fleet arrived, it was an absolute disgrace. There were many dead bodies. The ones that were alive were starving, and they had been ill-treated. They hadn't provided with proper medical care. So the First Fleet was successful. It was very well documented. I mean, I've also got here Phillips' journal and Clark's journal, and there's a number of First Fleet journals that document the fleet. And I like to think it was because the Navy was running the First Fleet that it worked so well. Now,
service.
in relation to Botany Bay or Sydney Cove, we have to remember that Cook arrived in Botany Bay in 1770, and he was looking for a safe haven for one ship for about a week in order to rest his crew and make repairs to the ship. And he happened upon the entrance to Botany Bay. So one of the problems with Botany Bay is the swell comes into the heads, and the whole bay suffers from sea swell. But he didn't worry about that. He got his botanists and illustrators ashore to look at the flora and fauna, and then sailed on. He was in a hurry to get going. So when Philip arrived with the first fleet, 11 ships, Botany Bay was clearly unsuitable. It was unsuitable for ships because of the swell. It was unsuitable as a headquarters for a settlement because the soil was poor and there was no clear provision of fresh water. Now, Cook had mentioned what he called Port Jackson when he went north from Botany Bay, and mentioned indentation in the coast. So Philip decided to check out this indentation in the coast and sailed in a whaleboat with a small team into what we call Sydney Harbour now, or Port Jackson. And he found the soil suitable for production. He found good water at the tank stream. And Governor Phillip writes in this book, on the 22nd of January, we set out upon this expedition, and early in the afternoon arrived at Port Jackson, which is a distance of about 3 leagues from Botany Bay. Here, all regret arising from the former disappointments was at once obliterated. Philip had the satisfaction to find one of the finest harbours in the world, in which 1,000 sail of the line might ride in perfect security. That was his words. And when they came into Sydney Cove then was a triangular-shaped cove, and at the head of it was the tank stream. And they found that they could anchor all 11 ships in Sydney Cove. So the bow was anchored to the seabed, and then they ran lines from the stern to trees, and they tied up the sterns of the ship to trees, and therefore all the ships could sit in a controlled way, and they could fit 11 ships in there safely and comfortably.
Oh, that's so interesting, and to get, you know, sort of an expert's viewpoint, Paul. We might go to some questions before I come back to Sally as well. And Vanessa, you can help me if I've missed any, because there was a this might be for Bill or Sally, just back to Alan's issue about sentencing under English law, and why were they transportees often sentenced to 7 or 14 years and then things were changed. I mean, and again, was it just a motivation for the colony rather than the punishment to fit the crime?
May I interrupt for just a moment, because I've heard a story that may not be true, but it sounds like you may have the answer. When they came up in the whaleboat and they came into Sydney, they ended up in Sydney Cove. I've read somewhere that Henry Kable was amongst those people, and he jumped out of the boat and carried Philip ashore. Now, has anyone else heard anything like that? I'm sure I read it, and it could have been fact or fiction, I don't know.
I like to promote this story. There are some newspaper reports that this is what happened. Paul sitting next to me has some doubts about it, but I think it's such a good story. Even if it isn't true, it's a good enough story.
Henry Kable, the first white man to set foot in Sydney Cove.
There's one other claimant, but I think Henry's is the one to run with. Yeah.
So it's a great story.
The whaleboat would have been the standard whaleboat crew from the Sirius who would have brought the Philip to Port Jackson, and I personally doubt that there would be any convicts in that crew. Sorry.
I think they had a good PR team in the Kable family to support what they're doing, and really some gumption. I mean, that was sort of is it Louise question that
Lisa,
you know,
Lisa had a question about
it's
that.
Lisa, sorry, yes, was really thinking about what you know, what do you think made them have the confidence to sort of support their claims?
So I'll go back to the one about the sentence, because Paul actually put some light onto this. What's really intriguing is Susannah stole a value of £3, linen, bed sheets. Henry and his dad and another guy cleared the house. So it's a bit humorous, and Bill will tell the story. They didn't just steal one or two things. They stole pretty much absolutely in the house, and it was worth £23, what he alleged stole. She got 14 years for £3 worth. He got £7. He got 7 years for £23. It is, when you look at what we made into a boarding sheet, we're hoping kids go, what? Why was this? Now, Paul explained this to me when he went through the records, is that Susannah stole from her employer. That's right, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah, privately stealing.
Privately stealing. So her sentence was significantly more, even though the value of goods was more. I'm not sure where 7 years came out, but what's intriguing is you got to remember they were in the jail for 3 years. You know, that they didn't just suddenly get put on the First Fleet and they had years languishing in prison. Then they get to Australia, and my understanding is all the records got lost. So where does the 7 years start from? You've had 3 years in prison. Is it another 4 years? It's actually it's a horrible situation. Is that your understanding, Paul? You given the expert.
There was another major event happened whilst they were in jail in Norwich Castle, and that was the American Revolution.
Absolutely.
And so the earlier sentences were transportation to America, and then when it was clear that they wouldn't go to America, it was transportation to an overseas place, so which are not yet determined. So the change from 7 to happen over that period. So I think it was arises from the doubt of where they were going to send these people.
Interesting.
And just on what Henry and his father's mate stole, I heard Jonathan King describe it as the gold medal event of the First Fleet, because to get all that stuff away, he said they really would have needed a Pantechnicon. So they had so much, everything wasn't nailed down.
They used a wagon. That's what gave them away, because the neighbor saw the wagon tracks in the orchard and alerted the police. So.
And we're very lucky that in our audience today, we have one of our board members who actually works at Museums of History, New South Wales. And she's just popped in and said the records of the sentences weren't sent with the First Fleet, but they did arrive later on. So they did eventually get the paperwork. It was just a bit delayed.
Thanks, Jeanette, for that, and thanks, Vanessa. And so I was wondering if this is really back to that point, that issue of equality before the law. Was it a sense that actually, depending on the social circumstances, the economic circumstances, the position in society of a person was really influencing their sentencing, their treatment in England at the time, as opposed to actually what the specific crime was, even without its context? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that and how we treat people today.
It's a tricky one. I find it amazing that in the rule of law, punishment has to fit the crime. Someone steals a handkerchief, they get sentenced to Australia. So, like I said, the ideal doesn't always work. I don't understand how that has happened in that case. But I think the social thing, that's important. And equality, that equalness, and that the way, and I hear that Paul is a fan of Arthur Phillip. He seemed to have had a real belief that people could be reformed. It wasn't just a dumping ground, but an opportunity to be able to have a business. So, I mean, the fact of this story is that the Kables could have a brewery, they could have a shipbuilding business, they could be the chief constable. And that is because they thought that there was a chance for them to have a chance in this new colony. And one of the key things is they had to be able to own property, and they had to be able to take action in court. because no one wants to start a business if it can be taken from you. No one wants to buy a house if the next day the governor can come and take it from you. And that's why, in a way, they say Australia is very stable, because the rule of law protects us, that we know we can have a house and the person in charge just can't take it. They have to give just, consideration. And the rule of law really enables a society to grow and to prosper and have business. And I think the Kables, the fact is they're everywhere. I keep meeting them. They're all coming out from under the woods there. And that is a tribute to the fact that they could do business, and they could, they had a chance to have a brewery or ships and things like that. And this enables their family line to be so prolific. And I keep laughing because I meet them all the time. We show people books and they say, oh, I'm related to a Kable. It's fantastic. And the Kables with the K and the C and the different spelling, you've got to remember they were illiterate when they came over. So they didn't come off the ship and say, just so you know, you spell my name Keacae. Each time they had a different person writing. And so that explains partly that we know that they couldn't write their name, but also that's why there's different spelling, because it's not like they all signed their passport when they got there. But
well, the same thing happens today.
Yeah.
When people ask my name for some registration purpose, Kable with a K, and then they write C. I said, hang on, you've written a C. I said Kable with a K. Oh, okay. Change it.
Yeah. Yeah. And Sally, just building on what you said about the businesses, there was a question from Lisa about how Henry built his wealth initially. I mean, it sounds like he had a bit of get up and go, but was there anything that's been found out about him sort of developing his wealth in the colony? I don't know.
Well, Bill can tell you some ways he built some wealth, probably not by the law.
Well, yes, he was very successful. He used that first victory in the courts as his starting point. But I think Paul's probably got some stories about how he developed his wealth. I mean, he seemed to skirt the edges of the law a few times. I mean, he was sacked from his. He was made chief constable at one stage, but then he was sacked from that job because of some dealing with American ships coming in and question of pork and all sorts of things going on. So, yes, he was a bit ruthless, I understand. He took advantage of, say, the Rum Rebellion, and he was able to, develop a very healthy portfolio of real estate as well as his other business interests.
Yes, he was also ruthless on the Hawkesbury, where a lot of the Hawkesbury settlers had borrowed money from him to develop their farms. And then the big flood came in the early 1800s and they lost their farms, but they still owed Henry money. And he said, oh, I'll excuse you your loans, but I will take your farms. So he suddenly got a whole range of farms along the Hawkesbury. There was no sympathy from him.
Absolutely. Oh no, and I think it's interesting to think of those characters and also how they took advantage of what was around at the time. But it seems, from our examples tonight, that the Kables are still doing well, which is really great to see as well. Perhaps more more kind of legal means and professional work, which is fantastic. Oh gosh, poor Lisa. Sorry about that. So he took a fifth great grandmother's farm. There's probably a bit of there's a plot in the movie about that one, I think, to uncover. And again, Jeanette, thank you for sending the link to the guide in there. So Sally, one of the things that we're going to do is perhaps challenge this audience to support the project. And we'll provide links when we send out the recording to from all the details that we've got tonight, but also ways in which they can get a copy of their own Lost Parcel. But what about the idea of getting folks to think about sending some copies to their old primary schools?
Absolutely.
Or primary schools from some of their ancestors from the last couple of 100 years. How about that?
Absolutely. So we go around to a lot of schools, and we're finding from the teachers is that they don't necessarily have the budget to buy books. We as an organisation send free posters out to teachers. Sometimes even 700 teachers at a time will request a free poster. So what we would love is if you buy a book for you, or you buy a book for your child to take to school, you take it to the school library that you went to, or you donate it and you help those schools teach it. So the resource is easy for them to use. And on our website, we have all the free education backup resources. We've got timelines and activities for kids to do that they just have to print out and to do. But we ask if you could buy one from us. You can buy it on Amazon or from the publisher and take it to the library, or get it sent straight to your local school and get them to say, this is a great book and I've got a family member. And that way we can get the story of the Kables out to schools, because it's a hard thing to get. Teachers, they often buy all their resources out of their own pocket. And so this is a way we can help them and teach about the Kables.
That's great. And Sally, really, what's ahead for you and the Rule of Law Education Centre? What's next on your?
What's next? Well, from a primary point of view, we're writing currently a book on Francis Forbes. It's the anniversary of the Supreme Court this year, so we're looking at how Francis Forbes went against Darling and insisted that the judiciary be independent. He insisted that the Governor Darling not tell him how to make his decisions. And also we continue to write resources for high school students. So we take kids to the courts and we write case notes. So we're actually just about to release one on the Folby case, which all students in year 11 and 12 love studying about. So things like that. So you can always follow us on Facebook or join our mailing list, become a member and support our work. So they're the big education things we have right now.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm just wondering if any of the Kables are related to the Forbes at all. That might be a nice thing, or any other Forbes family members here. We're just a little bit over time, but I just wanted to check in with Vanessa to say, are there any questions in the chat, or any questions from those in the room here that want to ask while we've got Bill and Paul and Sally with us, or other extended family in the room?
I think we've covered pretty much everything in the chat as much as we can in the time tonight. There was a couple of little mentions about the fact that there were, I know Bill mentioned it and someone's messaged me about there being various reunions and things of the Kables over the years. And we do actually hold quite a bit of documentation about some of those reunions in the SAG archives, which is partly how we got involved with the Rule of Law, because they came and had a look at the information in our archives. So it's just another little plug for, you never know what we've actually got in our archives, and make sure you are checking our Midas index. And you know, we were quite surprised when I asked Danielle Tebb to look up Kables. She came back with a whole page of information for me of different files that we had, and we had a lovely day going through them all with Sally and her colleague Justine. So, you know, we do have a surprising collection. But I think we got all the questions.
I saw one question come through. What happened to Henry's father and Henry's mate? They were both hanged.
Yeah, I think someone answered that in the chat for us, but yes, they were hanged. So.
The morning entertainment at the fair, I think so.
Yes.
Yeah. And so what's ahead for the Kable family? You know, are you also having a party, or we should have another reunion around the book, or other projects? I mean, we're going to put details of how to connect with Paul's website and also Paul's book as well. But what's the research for you, Bill and Paul, ahead?
Look, I'm not aware of any particular things. The last one was, I think, the 200th wedding anniversary of the first wedding. That was a few years ago in Windsor, but yeah, it needs someone in the family to put their hand up and organise something else.
Yes, I noticed Marie just said she was at the 230th anniversary of their first wedding that was held in 2018. Yes,
it was 230, and it was held in Windsor.
But that's also a great model to go for. Find some of those anniversary dates and plan some reunions. So yeah, the challenge is there for all of us. That's great. Okay, and Sally, any last words?
No, I have absolutely. I'm so grateful for you guys at the Society of Australian Genealogists. You set me up with the Kables. I would not have found so much information. I was not able, like Paul, to pour through the records in London. So we're really grateful for all that time he put into it. and he's been able to bring some things to life that, you know, it's great to see that he found the reprieve notices, and it's definitely worthwhile buying his book because it actually gives the depth that I couldn't put in a kid's storybook. So I'm really grateful that we could join up with you guys.
It's our pleasure, and I think what we also are hearing is other projects to come, and I think we again love to connect on all of those, but also, you know, trace more descendants of those of note and have you know, really made a difference to our modern day society. So thank you for the projects.
Fantastic.
So okay, all right, well, thanks everybody, and it's really been a great evening. And so you got your challenge one to think about the children and the schools in your life and your family history, but also, you know, seeing if we can get some more media attention and to support this story going further. All right, thanks everybody, and have a lovely night.
Thank you, Ruth and Vanessa and Sally, particularly for writing the book. It's great to get the story out.